Well, what do you make of this travel bubble, should it come into fruition? And you have to be very careful in setting these up. And let's also talk a little bit about the Trans-Tasman Sea bubble as well, between New Zealand and Australia, because it's hit a few snags.
So the travel bubble between Singapore and Hong Kong is really good news for the industry, because this is the first bubble that's a general travel bubble, not just aimed at essential travel, meaning diplomats or businessmen or students going to study. So this is very good news indeed, and it will help economic recovery, and it will restore connectivity, which hasn't been there since March. We had a recent survey from the Air Transport Action Group estimating that 46 million jobs worldwide are at risk from these closures. And so this is really going to help get things moving again.
But tell me, Conrad, who's likely to benefit more, Cathay Pacific or Singapore Airlines? And on top of that, which city is likely to see more input, or should I say more people flying to, than actually the other direction?
It's going to benefit them both, actually, Rich. That's a really good question, because what we see last year, around 450,000 visitors came from Singapore to Hong Kong. And in the other direction, about 490,000 Hong Kongers went to Singapore. So it's actually a pretty balanced relationship. And so I think both cities will benefit very much. And of course, there's a huge pent-up demand now for people who want to travel, and there aren't too many options. So I think Cathay and SIA are going to do really well from this.
Okay, but just going to the broader subject of COVID-19 and testing, you know, Changi Airport there in Singapore has made some strides in terms of having a laboratory there. Is it perhaps a blueprint for other airports?
We're saying that we need testing because we need to get rid of quarantines. What we've seen so far is that if there's a 14-day quarantine, it's the same as closing your borders, because in a recent survey we conducted in 11 markets, we found 83% of respondents saying, if there's a quarantine in place, I'm not going to travel. So we've got to have testing in place. We would prefer to see some sort of testing before departure. And ideally, if we can find countries with similar levels of COVID risk, much like Singapore and Hong Kong, then that takes away the need for any further testing. Of course, at the beginning, we expect governments to probably err on the side of more testing, but we'd like, as much as possible, we'd like to see no quarantine and limited testing.
Right, so Conrad, how are you pushing that message then? That message that you would like to see testing versus quarantine? What steps are you taking to push on that message?
Sweetheart, can you go and tell them? So basically, I'm sorry, there's a bit of building work going on in the place next door to me here. So basically, we've set out some criteria for testing. We're saying that the testing should be scalable because it needs to be able to cope with tens of thousands of people in a day. It should be affordable. We've set a target price of something less than $10. It has, of course, to be effective. It has to give acceptable levels of false negatives, false positives, and finally, it has to be fast. So we don't want situations where people have to sit waiting for test results for hours or even days at a time. So we've put those recommendations together with ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and we're working through what we call the CART process. It's a recovery task force to try and work with governments to implement this sort of testing, also with manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies. We need to come up with tests that meet those criteria and can be rolled out effectively. And probably most important of all, also have World Health Organization endorsement and really a sort of common standard that governments can get behind and support. So that's what we're doing, primarily with ICAO and the WHO.
Do you have any projections, Conrad, as to when things may start to get better, or is that just pure conjecture?
It's difficult to say. I mean, at the moment, as you know, there are 6 vaccines in development globally, and actually in trials. So one assumes that there will be some sort of vaccine next year. That will obviously be a game changer. In the meanwhile, it's absolutely essential that we have the testing regime in place that can remove the quarantines and get aviation restarted again. Back in June, we were estimating losses for the year of $84 billion. That was back in June, and since then, the markets haven't opened as we were hoping for. So that $84 billion loss will have got larger. Frankly speaking, we think that it'll take until 2024 to get back to 2019 levels for international travel. Domestic travel will bounce back sooner, but international will take a lot longer.
Right, this is anecdotal, but I had some friends returning to China just a few weeks ago, and on their flight were a number of people, 2 or 3 people, who were later confirmed to have COVID-19 flying in from Canada. What steps can airlines take, additional steps can airlines take to ensure the safety of passengers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, basically, we've seen 2 recent studies, one by manufacturers, Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, another by the US Department of Defense, looking at the airflow in an aircraft cabin. And they've worked out that the chances of actually catching COVID in flight are very low indeed. Globally, since the beginning of the year, we've seen something like 1.4 billion people travel. And of those, we've only been able to find 44 potential cases of in-flight infection, which gives you a 1 in 27 million chance of being infected based on experience year to date. And that chance is actually lower than the chance of being struck by lightning. So it really is a very safe environment indeed. We've also taken, as airlines, a lot of measures to make it even safer. We're asking everybody to wear masks in flight. We've got more frequent and deeper sanitization of aircraft. Airports are doing the same. We've also introduced contactless check-in, contactless boarding to reduce the chances of people actually mixing with one another. Also in flight, coming back to that in-flight transmission issue, we've reduced all of the normal magazines and things that you used to find in seat pockets. We've reduced the catering so that we minimize the interaction with the crew, between the passengers and the crew. So there's been a lot of measures that airlines have taken to absolutely drive that chance down to as close to 0 as we can get it.
Okay, one of the silver linings for the airliners, one of the few silver linings, has been the cargo volume that we've seen. Do you expect that volume to be sustained going forward?
Yes, I do. And I mean, one of the things that we've seen, it's been partially fueled by the internet and people purchasing more things online. And of course, that medium is supported by the air travel supply chain. So yes, indeed, cargo is doing better, and I do expect it to continue. Last year, cargo accounted for about 12% of airline revenues. This year, it'll be around 26% of airline revenues. We've seen a lot of airlines converting passenger aircraft to cargo aircraft because we don't have sufficient belly capacity. That's passenger aircraft using their belly capacity for cargo. We obviously don't have that to anything like the degree we had in the past. So this has been a little bit of a silver lining, and I do expect it to continue into coming years.
Conrad, you know, we've seen mass layoffs in the aviation industry in Europe and in the United States. Those cuts haven't been quite as deep in Asia by any stretch of the imagination, at least thus far. So I'm just asking a question. You know, these cuts in Europe and the US have been conducted by mainly these legacy carriers who've long wanted to get rid of staff to streamline, but various regulatory and I suppose union restrictions have prevented them from doing so. How far have they used the pandemic to get rid of staff, essentially something they've always wanted to do and hasten that process?
Yeah, I don't think it's about trying to use the process. I think it's been about survival. And I would also question that there's any difference in the levels that we've seen in Europe as against the levels that we've seen in Asia. I mean, we're talking easily upwards of 30% of staff being laid off in Asia, and very often more. And of course, we're seeing airlines also going out of business. I don't think it's a case of people using the opportunity. I think it's really it's about survival. Unfortunately, if we're down at averagely less than 10% of passenger aircraft flying, you don't need the crews, you don't need the ground staff, and you can't afford to continue to employ those people unless, of course, there are government subsidies in place that enable you to continue their employment. And some countries in Asia Pacific have been very good and very proactive in this, and that's enabled some airlines in some countries to continue to employ people, even though they don't really need them for the operation as it currently exists.